It was a hot summer day on July 13, 1953, when Thomas Matthews, known to most as Tommy, vanished without a trace. His disappearance shocked everyone who knew him in the city of Chicago. Tommy wasn't a criminal, nor was he involved in any shady business. He was a well-respected businessman, running a thriving construction company on the city's north side. At just 38 years old, Tommy had already built a solid reputation. His company was one of the most successful in the area, working on everything from local residential buildings to larger projects across the city. Tommy was the type of man who always kept his word. He was reliable, professional, and had a knack for getting things done. But on that particular day, he was nowhere to be found. It was a Wednesday when Tommy first went missing. That morning, he had been at the office, going over some final details for a new project. It was an unusually hot day for Chicago, with the temperature reaching nearly 90 degrees, but Tommy seemed unfazed. His usual crisp suit, his dark hair combed neatly back, he greeted his staff with his usual friendly smile. By 10:00 a.m., Tommy had left the office. He told his secretary he had a meeting to attend on the south side of the city. It was not unusual for him to take business meetings, especially considering the large contracts his company managed. He said he'd be back around noon. But noon came and went. Then, it was 1 p.m., and Tommy still hadn't returned. His secretary, Linda, grew worried. She called his cell phone. Nothing. She tried his office line, but it went straight to voicemail. By 3:00 p.m., Linda was calling around to his colleagues, asking if they had heard from Tommy. No one had seen him. Tommy's car, a sleek 1951 Chrysler New Yorker, was parked in its usual spot, so it seemed like he hadn't gone far. But where was he? It didn't make any sense. Tommy had never been the type to skip town without telling anyone, and certainly not in the middle of a workday, especially when so much depended on him. That afternoon, Linda drove to Tommy's house, hoping he had just gone home early. But the house was empty. There were no signs of him. His wife, Helen Matthews, was frantic. She hadn't heard from Tommy either, and she said that the last time she saw him was when he kissed her goodbye that morning, just before he left for work. The more time passed, the more everyone began to realize something wasn't right. By the evening, Tommy was officially missing. Chicago PD were called, but they didn't immediately treat it as urgent. Tommy was a businessman after all. It was possible he had just left on a sudden trip, they thought. Maybe he was on his way to visit clients or had to take care of something personal. But by Thursday morning, with no word from Tommy and no signs of where he might have gone, the police began their investigation. They started by retracing his steps. Where was Tommy last seen? His last confirmed location was his office in the Loop. But the journey from there to the South Side meeting was a short one. It was less than a 15-minute drive. The police checked the routes Tommy would normally take. They spoke with the people he was supposed to meet on the South Side. They confirmed Tommy had made the appointment, but when he arrived, no one saw him. The case began to feel more and more like a mystery, one that left everyone puzzled. How could a man like Tommy Matthews just vanish into thin air? He had no known enemies, and his business dealings had been straightforward. There was no reason for him to disappear, no threats against him that anyone knew of. Days turned into weeks, and Tommy Matthews was still nowhere to be found. His family was left with more questions than answers. Was he in danger? Had something terrible happened to him, or had he run away? There was no way to know for sure. Months passed, and the case began to grow cold. The police had no leads. Tommy's Chrysler was never found, and neither was he. The investigation stalled. Helen Matthews, Tommy's wife, couldn't give up hope. Every night she would sit by the window, hoping to see her husband's car pull into the driveway. She would wait for him to come home, even though deep down she knew that he might never return. By 1955, 2 years after Tommy disappeared, the police officially declared the case a cold case. They couldn't find any evidence to suggest foul play. They couldn't prove that he had been kidnapped or murdered. And the most bizarre part? There was no sign of his car anywhere. It was as if he had just vanished into thin air. But then, in 2025, a discovery was made that would send shockwaves through the city and reignite interest in the case. The story of Tommy Matthews was about to take a twist no one could have expected. It was a swampy stretch of land in southern Illinois, miles from Chicago, where the first clue was finally unearthed. The swamp had been largely untouched for decades, a place where few dared to tread. Dense trees and thick underbrush made it nearly impossible to see what lay beyond the first few feet of swampy ground. But in 2025, a construction company was clearing land in preparation for a new housing development. They were setting up equipment to excavate the area when their heavy machinery hit something hard. The sound was like a dull thud, followed by the unmistakable scrape of metal. The workers weren't sure what they had struck at first, but their curiosity led them to dig deeper. The machinery unearthed a piece of metal buried beneath the wet, muddy soil. At first, it looked like a rusty scrap of junk, perhaps a part of an old machine or vehicle. But when they cleared away the muck, they could see something more. A bumper, chrome, faded and corroded by years of being submerged in the swamp. It looked familiar, almost too familiar. The workers paused for a moment. Could it be? One of them, an older man named John Evans, recognized the shape of the bumper and the smooth lines of the vehicle beneath it. "That's a Chrysler," he muttered, his voice full of disbelief. "That's a 1951 Chrysler New Yorker." The very same model Tommy Matthews had driven before he disappeared in 1953. But how could it be? Had his car been here all along? John and the crew carefully excavated the area, uncovering more of the vehicle, piece by piece. The car was buried deep, nearly 8 feet under the surface of the swamp. The body of the car was covered in grime and plant growth, but there was no mistaking it. The Chrysler was a perfect match for Tommy's car, right down to the distinctive design features. But what made this discovery even more eerie was what they found inside the vehicle. The windows were fogged with years of accumulated dirt and grime, but when they carefully cleaned a section of the windshield, they could make out something in the driver's seat. A skeleton. It was the unmistakable remains of a human body positioned behind the steering wheel, just as it would have been in life. But the strange thing was, there was no sign of any serious damage to the car's exterior or to the body inside. The windows were intact, though opaque from years of being submerged. It looked as though Tommy Matthews had been sitting there, his hands on the wheel, waiting, or perhaps just trapped. The authorities were immediately contacted. Within hours, the Illinois State Police and the FBI were on the scene. They carefully extracted the vehicle from the swamp, using cranes and specialized equipment. It took days to fully lift the car from the murky water, and as they did, it became clear that this wasn't just an ordinary abandoned vehicle. This was the missing Chrysler, the one owned by Tommy Matthews, and it had been hidden away for nearly 72 years. As they began to inspect the car, forensic investigators carefully documented every detail. The interior was in remarkable condition, considering the years it had spent submerged in the swamp. There were traces of clothing still on the skeletal remains, and they carefully preserved everything they could to help identify the body. The clothes, though deteriorated, appeared to be a well-tailored suit, much like the one Tommy had worn on the day he disappeared. After careful examination, the investigators confirmed that the remains belonged to Thomas Matthews. They had found him. Tommy Matthews had been in the car all along, hidden beneath the swamp for over 7 decades. But that wasn't the only shocking discovery. The car's registration documents were recovered from a waterproof compartment in the glove box, confirming that it was indeed Tommy's Chrysler. However, what really caught the attention of the investigators were the newspaper clippings found in the glove compartment. There were several articles about Tommy's disappearance, stories that had made headlines in Chicago back in 1953. But among the clippings was one article that raised more questions than it answered. The article was about organized crime in Chicago. It discussed how several influential businessmen in the city had connections to the underworld, and how some of them had mysteriously disappeared. The article even mentioned a few names, and to the surprise of the investigators, Tommy Matthews was one of them. Could Tommy have been involved with Chicago's notorious crime families? Did his disappearance have something to do with the city's criminal underworld? And if so, why had his car been buried in a swamp, hidden away from the world for 72 years? The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but the more they uncovered, the more the case began to resemble a conspiracy, one that stretched far beyond Tommy Matthews himself. Investigators began to re-examine everything they thought they knew about Tommy's life. What they had once believed was the story of a businessman who had vanished one summer day in 1953 was now beginning to look like something much darker, something that had been carefully hidden for decades. But one thing was certain. Tommy Matthews hadn't run away. He hadn't left for a better life. His disappearance had been planned, and someone had gone to great lengths to make sure no one would find out what happened to him. But the questions didn't stop there. The more the investigation progressed, the more the authorities began to wonder, who buried the car in the swamp? Why was it hidden in such a remote, difficult-to-reach location, and how had it remained undiscovered for so long? As the investigators continued to piece together the mystery of Tommy Matthews's disappearance, they began to uncover troubling details. The more they dug, the more the story seemed to shift from one of a missing businessman to something much more sinister. Tommy Matthews had never been involved in organized crime, at least not in the way anyone had expected. The articles in the glove compartment, though, painted a different picture, a picture of a man who had been connected to people in high places, people with dangerous ties to Chicago's notorious crime families. But there was more. When forensic investigators examined the clothing found on Tommy's skeletal remains, they noticed something odd, a small, hidden compartment in his suit jacket. It was so well concealed that it hadn't been noticed during the initial investigation of the body. Inside the compartment, investigators found a set of keys. They were old, rusted, and had obviously been hidden away for years, but they were distinctive. The keys were clearly for a set of locks, but where they went, no one knew. The moment the investigators found the keys, a new theory started to take shape. Had Tommy been involved in something more than just business? Was he being blackmailed or perhaps coerced into working with dangerous people? Had he been forced into something so big that he had no choice but to disappear? The investigation into the mysterious keys led authorities to the north side of Chicago, specifically to a warehouse district that had been thriving in the 1950s. The buildings were large, abandoned, and often used for shadowy dealings. The area had long been forgotten, but one of the buildings that had once belonged to a construction company was still standing, just as it had been in Tommy's time. Local records revealed that Tommy Matthews had, indeed, owned a small warehouse in the district back in the 1950s. What was more troubling, though, was that this warehouse had changed hands multiple times in the years following Tommy's disappearance. Over the years, it had been sold to different owners, all of whom had connections to questionable people, many with links to organized crime. It seemed clear now that Tommy's business dealings hadn't been entirely above board. But why was the warehouse significant? As investigators pieced together Tommy's activities during the last few weeks of his life, it became clear that he'd been spending an unusual amount of time at that very warehouse. His colleagues had mentioned that he had been under extreme stress, speaking less about business and more about threats and warnings. Tommy had even told his wife, Helen, that he was afraid. "I don't know who I can trust anymore," he had said. "I've made enemies, and some of them are very powerful." Tommy's growing paranoia had been noticed by several of his close friends, but no one had suspected that it would lead to his disappearance. And yet, here they were, nearly 7 decades later, uncovering that the man who had seemed so unshakable had been caught in something far more dangerous than anyone had realized. Then came the next twist. When police checked the history of the warehouse further, they discovered that in the early 1960s, shortly after Tommy's disappearance, the building had been broken into. A fire had been set, but the damage wasn't as severe as it seemed. What was most intriguing, however, was the fire insurance claim made just weeks after Tommy's disappearance. The claim was unusual because it listed the warehouse as partially destroyed, though the damage seemed to be far more cosmetic than actual. Who filed the insurance claim? It turned out that a man named Salvatore De Luca, an infamous crime figure connected to the Chicago outfit, had signed the claim. Salvatore had been known to operate in the same areas where Tommy's company had been doing business, but he had long been suspected of running several illicit schemes through legitimate businesses. It now seemed like Tommy Matthews might have gotten caught in the crossfire of something much bigger. Had he been forced to participate in a criminal plot? Was his disappearance linked to a cover-up involving the insurance claim and the fire at the warehouse? The more the investigators looked, the more it seemed like Tommy's life had been linked to these underworld figures in ways they hadn't originally imagined. But as they dug deeper into the paper trail, a chilling discovery was made. One of Tommy's former colleagues, a man named James Carrington, who had worked with him for years, came forward with new information. James revealed that Tommy had been in touch with a man named Vincent Falco in the weeks before his disappearance. Falco was a well-known mobster who had dealings with both legitimate businessmen and criminal figures. It was rumored that Tommy had been trying to get out of a dangerous situation, one that involved extortion, bribes, and perhaps even murder. James said that he had overheard part of a conversation between Tommy and Falco just days before Tommy vanished. Falco had warned Tommy that he needed to keep his mouth shut, and that if he didn't, there would be serious consequences. Was Tommy's sudden disappearance a result of a deal gone wrong? A business partner's betrayal? Or was it something even darker? Now, with the discovery of his car in the swamp, the investigators had uncovered the hidden life of Tommy Matthews, a man who had once been thought of as a simple businessman, now revealed to have been caught in the web of organized crime, possibly forced to disappear to cover up someone else's dirty secrets. The investigators were closing in on a disturbing reality. Tommy's disappearance was far from an isolated event. It was part of a larger conspiracy, one that had been kept hidden for more than 70 years. The question now was, who else was involved, and how far did this go? As the investigation into Tommy Matthews's mysterious disappearance deepened, new evidence began to surface that suggested a much larger conspiracy, one that stretched far beyond the simple business world Tommy had once known. The key discoveries pointed not just to Tommy's involvement in something dangerous, but also to other powerful figures in the city, figures who had long managed to keep their secrets buried beneath layers of time and corruption. The discovery of the warehouse, which had once belonged to Tommy's construction company, had raised new questions. The fact that it had changed hands so many times, always falling into the hands of people with shady reputations, indicated that someone had been protecting the secrets within its walls. The fire in the 1960s had destroyed some of the evidence, but it hadn't been enough to cover up everything. It was clear now, the warehouse was more than just a business hub. It had been a site for illegal dealings, perhaps even a storage place for those involved in organized crime. But even with all these clues, one burning question remained unanswered. Who had been pulling the strings? The police had found out that Salvatore De Luca, the mobster who had filed the fire insurance claim, had many connections with the Chicago outfit, one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the country at the time. De Luca's name kept coming up in secretive meetings, and records showed that he had spent a lot of time in the same locations where Tommy had been seen, especially near the warehouse. De Luca was not alone in his dealings. The FBI began to piece together a network of people who had been using Tommy's business as a front for illegal activities. Some of the business partners Tommy had worked with had ties to the mob, and what's more, some of those partners had connections to politicians and police officers, people who had turned a blind eye to criminal dealings. Tommy's relationship with Vincent Falco, the notorious mobster, became central to the investigation. Falco had warned Tommy about the dangers of talking, but what exactly had Tommy learned that was so dangerous? Had he uncovered a corruption ring that reached into the heart of Chicago's business and government sectors? The more they discovered, the more it seemed that Tommy had been involved in something that had far-reaching consequences, something that could expose entrenched powers that many were willing to protect at all costs. In 2025, as the FBI looked deeper into Tommy's connections, they uncovered records showing that Tommy had tried to get out of his business dealings with the mob in the weeks before his disappearance. It seemed that he had been trying to cut ties with dangerous people. Phone records revealed a heated conversation between Tommy and Falco shortly before he vanished. The conversation had been about a business deal that was turning sour, and Tommy was demanding to be let out. It seemed he had learned too much, and the threat he had received from Falco wasn't just idle talk. The chilling realization dawned on the investigators. Tommy had been silenced because he had tried to escape from a criminal empire that had its roots deep within the city's underworld. The swamp where Tommy's car had been found, once thought to be an isolated random location, now appeared to be a carefully chosen spot. The swamp had been remote, difficult to access, and overlooked for decades. It was the perfect place to hide a body in a vehicle, far from the prying eyes of the public. Someone had known that Tommy's car would eventually be forgotten, buried by the passage of time. But who could have made sure Tommy was never found? Further investigation revealed that a number of individuals connected to the warehouse had suddenly disappeared in the years after Tommy's vanishing. Some had left the city, others had been found dead under suspicious circumstances. It became clear that Tommy's disappearance was part of a larger effort to cover up something much darker, an effort that had been carried out over decades with meticulous planning. Whoever was behind this conspiracy had been carefully erasing tracks and destroying evidence whenever it became too close to the surface. But as the investigators dug deeper, they unearthed a final twist that no one had expected. One of Tommy's old associates, a man named Henry Lambert, who had worked with Tommy in the early years of his construction business, came forward with a shocking claim. Henry revealed that Tommy had been researching something very specific just before his disappearance, a series of shady land deals tied to government corruption. Tommy had discovered that some of the city's most prominent politicians were involved in illegally transferring public land for private gain. Tommy had even threatened to go public with his findings, which could have led to a scandal that would shake the city to its core. Henry's revelation connected a series of dots that had previously been unrelated. The warehouse, the mafia, the fire, and even Tommy's final days all pointed to one shocking conclusion. Tommy Matthews had discovered a massive web of corruption, one that involved not just organized crime, but also the highest levels of power in Chicago. His disappearance wasn't just a result of mob retaliation, it was an attempt to stop him from exposing something far bigger. And as for the swamp, it wasn't just a grave, it was a message, a final act to erase Tommy Matthews from history, to make sure he wouldn't be around to reveal the dark truths he had uncovered. Tommy Matthews had been more than just a businessman. He had been a man of integrity who had stumbled upon a dark truth, a truth so dangerous that those in power would stop at nothing to keep it hidden. Now, 72 years after his disappearance, the world was finally beginning to learn the truth about the man who had been silenced for knowing too much. As the case continued to unravel, the investigators found themselves delving deeper into the corruption Tommy Matthews had uncovered before his disappearance. The more they learned about the shady land deals, the more they realized that Tommy's involvement in these dealings wasn't just a simple matter of bad business decisions. He had stumbled upon something far bigger, something that involved not just the mafia, but also the highest echelons of political and business power in Chicago. Tommy had discovered a network of illegal land transfers where public property was being sold off to private developers at a fraction of its real value. The corrupt politicians and businessmen behind these deals were making millions, and they were using their connections to cover their tracks. Tommy's discovery had been a bombshell that, if exposed, could have brought down some of the most powerful people in the city. Tommy had been afraid. He had confided in his wife, Helen, about the dangerous people he had encountered. He had told her that he was scared for his life, but also determined to expose the truth. He had even mentioned that he was gathering evidence to take to the authorities. The timing of his disappearance couldn't have been more telling. Tommy had been on the verge of blowing the lid off a major conspiracy, one that would have shaken the foundations of Chicago's political and criminal landscape. But someone had made sure Tommy would never speak again. As the investigation continued, the FBI began to uncover even more disturbing details. The land deals that Tommy had been investigating weren't isolated cases. They were part of a much larger plan that stretched far beyond Chicago. There were whispers of similar schemes in other major cities, all involving the same shadowy figures: businessmen, politicians, and organized crime syndicates working together to line their pockets at the expense of the public. The connection between the mafia and the political elites in Chicago had always been suspected, but Tommy had been the one to finally put the pieces together. He had known too much, and it had cost him his life. But what had happened to Tommy after he was silenced? The swamp where his car had been found had been the perfect burial ground. It was remote, hidden, and easily overlooked. Whoever had buried the car there had done so deliberately, ensuring that the body would remain undisturbed for decades. Tommy had been trapped, and his secrets had been locked away with him. Then, in a final twist, the investigators uncovered something that would forever change the course of the case. Hidden within the records of the land deals, they found the name of someone who had been involved in the corruption all along, someone who had managed to stay hidden in the shadows for decades. It was none other than Vincent Falco, the mobster who had threatened Tommy just days before he vanished. But there was more. Falco's name was also connected to a high-ranking politician, a man who had been influential in the city for over 30 years. This politician, it turned out, had been using his position to protect Falco's criminal enterprises. The politician's ties to the mafia went back to the 1940s, and his name had been linked to several unsolved disappearances over the years. But until now, no one had ever been able to prove the connection. With this new revelation, the investigation finally began to connect the dots between Tommy's disappearance and the political corruption that had allowed these criminal activities to flourish for so long. It became clear that Tommy had been caught in the middle of a dangerous power struggle, and his life had been sacrificed to protect the interests of those at the top. But even as the investigators closed in on the truth, they faced a daunting realization. Tommy Matthews' story was not just about a single man's disappearance. It was part of a larger pattern, one that involved countless victims whose stories had never been told. Tommy had been one of the few who had tried to fight back, and for that, he had been silenced. The mafia, the corrupt politicians, and the powerful businessmen had managed to keep their secrets hidden for decades. But now, With the discovery of Tommy's car and the evidence they had uncovered, the walls were beginning to crumble. The truth was finally coming to light, and the people who had been responsible for Tommy's death were being exposed. However, the story didn't end there. The investigators were faced with a difficult decision. They could follow the trail of corruption to its bitter end, but doing so would mean exposing the powerful figures involved, figures who had been protected by the system for years. Would they have the courage to bring them to justice, or would the truth be buried once again? As the investigation reached its climax, the final pieces fell into place. Tommy Matthews had been murdered, not just because he had uncovered a criminal operation, but because he had been a threat to the power structure that had been in place for so long. His disappearance had been part of a larger effort to keep the corrupt system intact, but Tommy Matthews had left behind a legacy of courage and integrity, even in the face of unimaginable danger. His death had not been in vain. It had sparked a reawakening, one that would forever change the course of Chicago's history. The powerful figures who had once controlled the city from the shadows were no longer safe. As the investigation drew closer to the truth, the city of Chicago found itself on the brink of a reckoning. Tommy Matthews, the man who had once been a simple businessman, was now at the center of a web of corruption that reached to the highest levels of power. His death, long thought to be a mysterious disappearance, was now revealed to be a calculated murder, part of a sinister plot to silence a whistleblower who had uncovered something too dangerous for the powerful to ignore. The evidence was irrefutable. Tommy had been murdered because he had found the truth, a truth that had been hidden for decades, wrapped in layers of deceit, greed, and political maneuvering. The mafia's grip on the city, intertwined with corrupt politicians, had allowed the criminal syndicates to flourish in the shadows for years. But Tommy had tried to break free. He had tried to expose them all, and for that, he had been silenced. The FBI, working in tandem with local law enforcement, had followed the trail of evidence back to the very people Tommy had been trying to expose. They had uncovered a shocking connection between Vincent Falco, the mobster who had threatened Tommy, and a high-ranking politician who had wielded influence for over 3 decades. This politician, who had managed to keep his name out of the public eye, was directly involved in the illegal land deals that Tommy had been investigating. But the most damning evidence came from Tommy's own records. It turned out that Tommy had been meticulously gathering evidence, documenting the corruption in Chicago's political and criminal networks. He had compiled a dossier, a collection of documents, photos, and recordings that linked several powerful figures to criminal activities. The dossier, Tommy had hoped, would be his insurance. If anything happened to him, he had planned to leak it to the press or perhaps to the authorities to ensure that the truth would come out. The authorities now had everything they needed to dismantle the network of corruption that had plagued Chicago for years. But there was a catch. The powerful figures involved in the scheme had spent decades covering their tracks, and they weren't going to go down without a fight. The investigation into Tommy's disappearance had already shaken the foundation of Chicago's criminal elite, but now the question was, who would be willing to take the final step? Would the authorities pursue the case to its bitter end, risking the wrath of the city's most dangerous people, or would they back down and let the powerful figures continue their reign? The political pressure was mounting. Some of the city's leaders, those with deep ties to the mafia, had already started to work behind the scenes to suppress the truth. They feared that exposing the full extent of the corruption would lead to a public backlash that could ruin careers and bring down the very system that had kept them in power for decades. The city's future hung in the balance. The investigators were at a crossroads. They had to decide whether they would allow the conspiracy to continue to thrive in the shadows or whether they would stand up and bring justice to the men who had silenced Tommy Matthews. In a stunning twist, it was revealed that Tommy's wife, Helen, had been quietly assisting the investigation all along. She had never stopped looking for her husband, and in the years since his disappearance, she had uncovered details that no one had known. Helen had always believed that Tommy had been involved in something much bigger than just a business deal. She had kept a journal of her own, documenting her suspicions and findings over the years. It was Helen's determination that had played a crucial role in piecing together the final part of the puzzle. She had secretly kept in touch with several investigative journalists and had provided them with key pieces of evidence from Tommy's files. It was this quiet rebellion against the system that allowed the truth to finally emerge. As the investigation continued to make headlines, the city of Chicago watched in shock as the identities of those involved in the scandal were exposed. The mob bosses, the corrupt politicians, and the business tycoons who had long held power were now being brought to justice. The press was filled with stories of arrests and court hearings as the public learned about the extent of the corruption that had once been hidden from their eyes. Tommy Matthews, the businessman who had disappeared in 1953, was finally recovered from the swamp where his car had been buried for so long. His body, though long decomposed, was now the symbol of the fight against corruption that had consumed the city. Tommy's death had not been in vain. His legacy was one of courage and integrity, a reminder that even the most powerful systems could be brought down by those willing to stand up for what was right. But even as justice was being served, the questions did not stop. How many others had been silenced in the same way as Tommy? How many others had tried to expose the truth, only to be swallowed by the same corrupt system? And what would happen to the powerful figures who had orchestrated Tommy's murder? Would they face justice, or would they slip away once again, hidden in the shadows? The investigation may have reached its conclusion, but for the people of Chicago, the legacy of Tommy Matthews would live on. His story would serve as a reminder that even in the darkest corners of power, there were always those willing to seek out the truth, and that sometimes even the smallest acts of bravery could lead to the exposure of the greatest injustices. And so, Tommy's name was finally cleared. His death was no longer a mystery. His murderers had been identified, and the truth had been brought to light. Tommy Matthews, the businessman who disappeared in 1953, would never be forgotten.